Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me today is my friend Joe Boslet and his new book, Little Round Top at Gettysburg, a reassessment of July 2nd. How you doing, Joe?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Chris.
I'm glad to have you on here. Now, like Little Round Top, Gettysburg, very popular topics. So a bold choice to write about them. Tell me about your decision to dive right into this favored ground of the battlefield.
I have been studying this for a while. I mean, I'm still a student of the war. I don't consider myself a historian. I'm a professional engineer by education and training. So I had to learn a lot of liberal arts things to put this together. But the more I read, I found out there were just a lot of inconsistencies. And there were some inaccuracies which bothered me a little bit. So I started to go into the primary sources and found out that maybe there was another story that was a little closer to what happened. I mean, you and I both know we're working with records that are 160 some years old. You're not going to get things exactly right, but I felt I could get a little bit closer to maybe what was the right story. So I went back into narratives and regimentals, and I'm a combat veteran of Vietnam. So when I was reading the narratives, I was actually reliving some of the experiences that I had in Vietnam because, as I've told some people, combat is combat. But after checking a number of things out, I thought, wow, this would be something worthwhile to write about. So I actually approached a few publishers, and Ted Savas said, "Hey, I'll do it for you," and off we went.
So I want to focus in on that word reassessment that's in your subtitle because you might have chosen any number of words, and let's get into the weeds here about what's going on a little round top. But reassessment, tell me about that word.
We all work off of other people's work, and my intent was not to beat anybody up, make anybody look bad. There is always room for maybe another story or another angle. I was in military intelligence in the Army, and we were taught to follow threads out to where there's absolutely nothing left. So my research, I doubled the kinds of citations, references that I needed because I was looking at maybe changing the story. And when I ran the manuscript by several of my friends, and then Mitch Yokelson, who's pretty well known with his World War II stuff, helped me get the manuscript in order for Ted. And then I had two people with Ted, in addition to peer reviews, help me with the manuscript. What we were looking at was, and the Savas people helped me with the title. I felt the reassessment and reevaluation was appropriate all along, but I didn't know how to put it in there.
Mhm.
But it's basically not a new new history necessarily, but it's a new way to tell the story. And after I put it all together, people were telling me, "Wow, this is really something because we haven't taken this approach before." And then plus spending a lot of time on the ground, Chris, and being with you on our battle walks, you always emphasize how important it is to study the ground, to read the ground. And of course, in the military, that's something that it's very important to know that. And in Vietnam, since our maps were all photo surveyed, there wasn't anything on the ground that was that accurate. So sometimes if you didn't read the ground right, you could get yourself in a lot of trouble. But some of the things were more obvious, like the position of the 83rd Pennsylvania. Everybody has them in a linear formation on the south slope of Little Round Top. Never happened. I had so many sources to back up, including Wyman White, one of the second U.S. sharpshooters, who, after they were chased through the Slider farmstead and the gorge on Plum Run, ended up fighting with the 83rd PA in their position below the 44th New York. On the monument, it says their position was in front of this monument. And you and I both know what regiments went through to get their monuments placed on the battlefield. Not only the soldier stories, the state commissions, the GB Memorial Committee, and then of all people, John Batchelder. A lot of people checking to make sure this was right. But historians and writers have missed this for years. And it's very obvious when you get in that position why they were there. And plus, the ground has changed. I found looking at some of Warren's old maps that position, the ground could have been anywhere from 12 to 15 feet lower than what we see today because of all the grading and all the work that they do when they build roads. Plus, there were more rocks there because they were using some of those rocks, crushing them up to make road beds. So you start looking at some of this stuff, and it's like, wow, there's another story here. So that sort of spurred me on to maybe look at a lot of other things, which I did, including more of Chamberlain's stuff, not believing everything out of Killer's Angels. Oh, that's a great story. People ask me if it's worthwhile to read. I said, heck yeah, it gets a lot of people interested in it. And then you can go on from there. But you don't poo-poo anything. There's value in something. But even Chamberlain's story, even when historians were telling it, were missing some points that even Chamberlain uh, included in his writings. So it just gets a little frustrating when you look at things. And being an engineer, uh, I won't say I had a hard time finding things because I spent a lot of time in the Army Archives at Carlisle. I'm a volunteer down there. So I almost had free run of that archive. And you know what Dr. Summers did with that archive, him being a Civil War guy. I mean, he loaded that place with lots of good primary sources. So me not only working there, but having the run of the place, I was able to find things that sort of corroborated or verified or supported some of the things that I was looking at that were a little different than what some of the other writers and historians have included in their work.
So a lot to unpack there. I want to kind of go back to something you said a second ago or a minute ago, where you said, I wanted to tell a different story. And let me have you just kind of explain that phrase a little bit, because some people might think like, oh, you're just kind of making something up or trying to just put a spin on it for the sake of putting a spin on it. But I think this goes back to your idea of like following all of these threads to their very end, and these threads are telling you a different story.
Chris, that's a great question, and I'll tell you why it is. I looked at the battle from a soldier perspective. I did not look at it from a historian's perspective. I looked at it like an individual soldier would have to deal with the kind of situations they had down there. And whether you're getting shot at with an AK-47 or a 69 caliber smoothbore musket, for a soldier, it's the same thing. I was reading so many things in the narratives that brought back memories that I had in Vietnam. Also, a lot of writers spent more time maybe on the southern side than they did on the northern side. I found some of the command things that the Union was dealing with were not adequately not only reviewed but discussed. The Union command system on Little Round Top did one heck of a job. Nobody's even talked about that in the past. Even after Vincent was wounded, Jim Rice from the 44th New York stepped right in, didn't even miss a beat. Chamberlain complains about not being supplied with ammo. Well, that was a bunch of baloney. He was supplied at least twice. And with the command change, the first thing Rice did was ask his aides to go grab ammunition. So we know at least the 20th Maine was supplied once, and they were supplied again the second time. And Melker or Melcher, however you want to, is like tomato, tomato, and Captain Spear, two of Chamberlain's sort of right-hand lieutenants, even though one was on the left flank, kept his story straight throughout the years after the battle because his story kept getting better. But they neither one of them mentioned running out of ammunition, and both of them were on the flanks, and both of them pretty well exposed. Uh, Interesting though, when you start to look at a perspective of a soldier, the kind of things that come out. And Harold Knudsen helped me with some of this. He wrote a good book on Longstreet with Savis Beatty. Helped me try to meld in our military training and our military thinking and tactics and so on with what would be happening during the Civil War era. And that's something else. You know, we're all in 2026 now. Try to go back 160 some years and get in the minds of the people back then. But you start looking at basics, you can get yourself in that mindset pretty easily. And even though things seemed to be a little more simple in those days, they really weren't. They were in combat, they were just as complicated as some of the things that we deal with today. So, on your question, that was one of the main things that sort of drove me to take a look from a different perspective on how would this be from a soldier's standpoint. And I have enough excerpts and narratives and anecdotes in there from the soldiers that indicate there's more to this story than just basic history and the official records and yada, yada, yada. I mean, we all know the official records. I even found this in Vietnam. Most of the officers are writing to protect reputations or enhance reputations. Most of us who were writing, and I kept a journal while I was in Vietnam, we all saw just a little bit of it, but we had no reputations to worry about. Whatever we wrote down what we saw. And that's why I place so much value in the soldier narratives. And I went to original copies or original transcripts. I didn't trust things I was finding in other books because authors have a habit of cherry picking some of the narrative statements. And you know this too, because I've read you, and you do the same thing I do. You go on front of the what was quoted and on back of what was quoted, and it's amazing the kind of things
Yeah.
you find when you do that kind of research.
Yeah, yeah, and and of course, I'm always looking for that good soundbite. Here's that one great evocative quote. But if you take it out of context, it can ruin the value of what it's actually contributing to your story.
Absolutely. I don't have a problem with a soundbite. I do have a problem with not including the preface and the end story because they're part of that anecdote.
Yeah. So let me ask you, let's set the table for listeners for a second. And since you are reassessing the story of Little Round Top, what's the traditional story that most people start with when they hear about this story? What needed to be reassessed? And I'll sort of kind of get into your take on it. But what's that original story that people think they know?
Well, things that I was looking at to try to overcome might be pretty well outlined in Killer Angels or the Gettysburg movie because most people they're visual learners and that's where they come from. But I went a little bit further than that. There's too much Chamberlain stuff that he sort of overwhelms everybody else. All the other regimental commanders were heroes in their own right. They did a heck of a job. The Southerners, I think, get thrown under the bus a little bit. They had major command issues from when Hood got wounded, Law being somewhat non-existent during most of the second, and the regimental commanders, including William Oates, my favorite guy, uh, having to put up with all these changes. And then the fact that when they were making their attacks on Little Round Top, they were somewhat disjointed. They weren't coordinated, other than the Fourth and Fifth Texas. Those guys seemed to be working together pretty well in that southwest part of the slope against the 16th Michigan and 44th New York. But literally every one of those regiments had to deal with a command change during the combat. And people have not talked about that enough, that the impact that that has on a soldier when you're not only under a very stressful condition, uh, you have commanders that are trying to get a hold of what's happening, and people are dying. I mean, this isn't like we're in an office and somebody decides they change the flavor of coffee in the coffee machine and you try to deal with that. There is serious situations going on, and I thought the Confederates did a heck of a job. In fact, after that long march from over in Cumberland Valley, 20 miles up the Seminary Ridge, and then another six, including Longstreet's counter march and yada, yada, yada. By the time they got to the base of Little Round Top, it was somewhere around 26 miles. Not enough hydration, did not probably eat enough. Uh, a lot of them shoeless, and a lot of people don't realize some of the Union soldiers were shoeless too. The 140th New York that made that final attack on Little Round Top, helping the 16th Michigan, they estimate about 20% of those guys were shoeless too. I mean, people don't realize the Union Army was putting up with the same stuff the Southerners were. But I went to the Alabama State Archives to try to find a little more information, a little more background. I mean, people, uh, there's a lot of really good authors out there. Fonz's stuff is unbelievable. I like Stephen Sears's stuff, but they were reporting the facts, the history, uh, pulling things. They weren't putting the human element in the fighting. And part of my reassessment was putting that human element, what these soldiers had to deal with, the kinds of things that they experienced. One of the soldiers in his narrative after the fighting was done, when the sun went down, and oh, by the way, every author has the wrong time for sunset on July 2nd, 1863. They had 7:27. It is actually 7:41, period. No doubt about it. Naval Observatory time, historical records, yada, yada, yada. There's even one author, and you know who it is. He mentioned twilight at Little Round Top. Baloney. They were fighting in full daylight. They could see each other too well to kill each other. But looking at one of the narratives, one of the soldiers was laying on. Hold on a minute. I think I lost. There we go. One of the soldiers was laying down thinking about what happened that day, and he saw the full moon. The full moon come out somewhere around 9:30, 10 o'clock, looking at the moon. And he told a story about thinking about back home, his wife was seeing the same full moon. I had the exact same experience in Vietnam. I'm in Vietnam on a night operation, quiet time before we had to pull out. And I'm looking at the full moon in Vietnam and thinking back home, 9,000 miles away, my wife's looking at the same full moon. And I got chills in my spine when I read that. It's like, holy cow, we're not that much different. You know,
Yeah,
we had
wow.
different weapons and maybe better food and uniform, whatever. But hey, soldier's a soldier, Chris.
Let me back up to what you talked about with the Confederate leadership and William Oates. And it seems like when people recount the story of Little Round Top, it really comes down to Oates versus Chamberlain off on the left flank. And like all the Confederates who wrap around the front of that hillside tend to get forgotten about because the focus kind of narrows in on Oates. What's going on with the rest of the Confederates as they're assaulting Little Round Top? Because there's some pretty incredible action there.
I covered each one of those regiments in detail. And as I said, I worked with the Alabama State Archives. In fact, I worked with them so much and shared with them what I was writing. They actually wrote me a note and said how much they appreciated a Northern author covering those units so well, especially on Little Round Top, because everybody talked about the 15th Alabama, maybe a little bit of the 47th, but mentioned, the two Texas regiments from Robertson's group and the 44th and 48th Alabama. And the 4th Alabama, it's like, where were these guys? And then they said to me about, it's really unusual. And I said, well, I want you to remember this. I'm from southern Pennsylvania, so I have a little bit of some loyalty to the southern troops. But with all the things that they put up with, they did so well. Numerous attacks. I mean, the historians talk about 4 to 6 attacks. The number of attacks is hard to discern because some of these were pulses and pushes off of main attacks. They would attack and then just fall back a little bit and then hit again. That's not another attack. That's the same attack. It's just the evolution of attacking. It isn't like, okay, we attack, then we pull back, and then everybody writes in their journal, okay, we made one attack. All right. 10 minutes later, all right, we're going to attack again. Some of these attacks were continuous. They lasted anywhere from, 15 to 25, 30 minutes. And on the slope, I did a study of the slope, Chris. That hill was unbelievable for attacking troops. The slope factors on that, and I have that included in detail in footnotes, and I also have it covered, I think, in one of my appendices. For hiking and climbing, some of those slopes are so steep they call them technical, that you have to have equipment. These guys had weapons, their ammunition, and then they were deal. I've walked that slope I don't know how many times. It's not the easiest ground to cover. There's a lot of sharp rocks in there. There's a lot of brambles and other kinds of bushes and stickers. Not to mention the ants. If you lay down for too long, the ants will find you. Oh yeah, and we're talking middle or beginning of July. They'll find you. But looking at the two Texas units, They almost broke the line with the 16th Michigan. Of course, I cover that too. The 16th Michigan didn't disappear. They were one of the top units in the Union Army, one of the top units in the Army of Potomac. They're in Fox's 300. They were probably the most trustworthy regiments that Vincent had under his command because of their experience. I'm not cutting down the other units, but and that's why he moved them from the left flank over to the right flank early on after they got themselves in place because he saw the Confederate attack thrust, come up out of the Plum Run Valley. And they only had about 230, 240 people. So he knew he could move them over fast. Plus the fact he knew he could trust them to fight. I think their commander, Norval Welch, was in the process of refusing the flank after all the pressure he got because everything I read from soldier narratives, that seemed to be what was happening. Not that they broke. They were trying a maneuver, which is tough under parade ground circumstances, and got caught in the middle of that maneuver. Of course, we're lucky Warren found Weed and found the 140th New York with Patty O'Rourke and got them up to the hill. And a lot of people credit Warren taking them up to the hill. They didn't. Washington Roebling guided them up to the top of the hill. And everybody says, well, then where did Warren go? Well, Warren was chasing after Webb to have him have, or Weed to have the rest of the people, rest of his brigade up the Little Round Top, which you did eventually get the rest of them up there.
So when the Confederates are first getting into position to make their assault, there's a lot of confusion. McLaws is supposed to go first, and the flank turns out to be a different spot, and so Longstreet adjusts the march. Hood ends up getting the duty to make that attack, and then, as you mentioned earlier, he gets knocked out of the attack really early. So there's
Yeah.
a lot of confusion among the highest levels of the command. How did you see that trickle down to the soldier view as this attack was unfolding?
I'm going to answer this the best I can, but you already know the answer because I've read your books. Uh, the attack plan, Lee had no intention of hitting Little Round Top. Hood kept warning Longstreet, there's some other stuff going on over there. Maybe we need to change our attack access. And of course, you know what Longstreet said. Hey, we're under orders to do this. This is what we're going to do. Well, they started across Bushman Farm. Of course, that's where Hood got wounded. And then the Slider Farmstead. And I know you've walked it. I have a video that I watched Doug Dowds and Gary Haldeman walk that. They couldn't even stay on their feet. It was so bad. Talk about rough ground.
Yeah.
And again, most of those soldiers did not have shoes. But after they started across that, the second U.S. sharpshooters were really causing some problems. And a lot of people don't know that three companies of those sharpshooters actually melded into Vincent's brigade on Little Round Top. And just think of the additional firepower they added to all of that. But anyway, as they were moving across those farm fields, they were sending people out to protect the flank. I mean, they lost almost 120 soldiers from the 48th and the 47th Alabama to give flank protection on the right side over toward Big Round Top. And as part of Oates's people in the 47th Alabama moved over there, everybody else was going up that axis that they originally wanted to attack parallel to Emmitsburg Road, and that created a gap. So they had to pull some troops out of Law's brigade to fill in that gap. So that's how we had all this crossover stuff. And Hal Jesperson did a heck of a job for me on my maps, laying that out. And I know you've used his maps too, to show clearly how this jostling around, how they got themselves in the positions that they did. But with the command, I think after Law took over, pretty much the rest of the battle, each of those regimental commanders were pretty much on their own. Most of them, though, did make an effort to work with each other. And like I said earlier, I think the 4th and 5th Texas did a better job of it. I mean, I loved those Texas troops, some of the stuff that they had to deal with. But going up the gorge at Plum Run and running into the 4th Maine, I think surprised some of the Alabama troops. And a lot of people didn't realize the efforts of the 4th Maine were very similar to what the U.S. sharpshooters did. They delayed them enough that it gave Vincent some extra time on Little Round Top to get himself organized, and nobody mentioned that before. He was down there, Elijah Walker, the big firefighter from Maine. In fact, most of his regiment were firefighters and a few loggers and seafarer. But anyway, he was there to guard Smith's New York artillery. And that was another story, which I do have covered on how it all came about. But Elijah Walker did a hell of a job slowing down some of that activity on that flank. And that ended up to be the same flank that hit the 16th Michigan. So add another 10 to 15 minutes to that assault by the 48th Alabama. The 44th provided flank protection. The 44th Alabama and the 4th Texas hit that flank. Add another 15 minutes to that, and that story might have been a little bit different because 140th New York wouldn't have gotten up there in time. But just all these events is what I said at the end of when I give my talks, and in the book I also mention it too. Just such little things, and you put them all together, and it's amazing what kind of impact that they can have. And I had breakfast today with some of my Vietnam veteran friends, and we were talking about the same things. I was an E5 sergeant. I did have command authority. I spoke the language. I was embedded with the Vietnamese, and I actually ran operations with them in the field. If you don't take care of the small stuff, you're going to get hurt. If you keep focusing on the big stuff and forget about the small stuff, you're going to get hurt too. So even in the Civil War, same theory in combat, same theory in battle. You better take care of the small stuff. And for the most part, the units seemed to take care of the small part okay, but then they forgot about taking care of the big part. But a lot of that was due to the command and control issues that they had to deal with. And a lot of people didn't talk about how serious that was. But the troops fought magnificent. I mean, there is no give back, give up, whatever. They kept going in spite of all the things that they had to deal with.
Before I shift over to ask a couple questions about the Northern Command, let me just ask you about James Longstreet for a second. What's your assessment of him or your reassessment of him?
I am not sure whether I have an opinion about him in the book. My personal opinion is he could have been on the team a little bit stronger. I don't think he fully exercised the level of command and control that was required on that flank. He did what he was sort of supposed to do, but there just didn't seem to be the uh, sincerity, loyalty, behind it. I mean, it's one thing for a commander to do everything he's supposed to do by the book, but to put himself in that situation, to make an investment, to make a commitment, after everything I've read, including Corey Farr stuff, Harold Knutson stuff, I think they share the same opinion that Longstreet just wasn't 100% engaged. And I think I wish he would have listened to Hood when Hood wanted to do his reconnaissance and was thinking about getting a little further around the flank. I do agree he couldn't get too far around the flank or he'd be disconnected. But they didn't realize they were running into those problems until they started their attack across the farm fields. But you got to make adjustments. It's like Moltke or somebody said it in Germany. You got a plan, but the plan's only good until the firing starts, and then you got to make your adjustments. And the same thing here. I think Confederates, unfortunately, didn't make the kind of adjustments they needed to make to be successful. But you look at the whole end of this thing, Chris, and I think they had the deck stacked against them. The Union had too many reinforcements, and the Confederates had none. And there's a question asked about, them taking Little Round Top and what it would have done. As an artillery platform, it was crap because, it was parallel to the line. There was no way they get more than two guns up there, and it wouldn't have been that effective. But the Union, not just the Sixth Corps, but they had Fisher there. They had the rest of Weed's brigade. they had enough people there that if they would have made any kind of a occupied part, they would have been pushed off very quickly. And of course, Meade would not have been satisfied with anything less than, winning that part of the line because that was his flank. I mean,
Right.
everybody talks about Chamberlain and guarding the left flank. Well, 16th Michigan was out there first. They got the message from Vincent about, hold at all costs. And then after he moved them, then Chamberlain got the same word, hold at all costs. Of course, Chamberlain, he's very, very well known for holding at all costs. Yep, I love the story about Chamberlain and Melcher and Spear. I mean, just fascinating. And Oates's Rock. That's another story. I have that covered in the book. I've dispelled Oates's Rock because his brother wasn't there. He was in the center of the line. That was the company he was commanding. He wasn't around that flank. Anyway, all right, go ahead,
Yeah, yeah.
Chris.
No. So if folks don't know the story of Oates' Rock, though, why don't you fill them in?
All right, if you go to what is called Vincent's Spur, which I would like to see renamed Chamberlain Spur because that was a part of the ground on the south slope of Little Round Top on the left flank. The Chamberlain and the 20th Maine were disposed. The left flank of his line, commanded by Captain Spear, there is a rock that the guides and the rangers will quickly point out called Oates's Rock that supposedly William Oates's brother John, who was commanding a company in the 15th Alabama, when he was wounded, they put him behind it to protect them from further wounds. And of course, he got shot 5 or 6 times. There's still some question exactly how much, but once is enough, believe me, with 58 caliber round, they hurt. Uh, Investigating that a little bit more, John's company was in the middle of the 15th Alabama's line, almost right in front of the position where the 20th Maine Monument is. Now, there's a bunch of rocks down in that area, and they're a lot better to hide behind. You get over to the Oates's Rock on the left flank, and I even laid down. I had some of the people that were with me laid down. You can't hide anything over there. And I'm even counting the fact that maybe they added some dirt behind the rock. There's just not the kind of cover you would expect. But discounting it from the standpoint of his brother wasn't even there. His company was in the middle of the line, not on that flank.
So let me shift gears to the federal leadership for a minute. And probably the first person we should start with is Gouverneur K. Warren, the savior of Little Round Top, whose statue graces the hilltop today. What is your assessment of Warren's activity that day, and what role did you see that he came to play?
Good question. That's why I have an appendix in my book on his timeline, his whereabouts, because they have Warren running all over the place. Warren was the chief topographical engineer of the Army of Potomac. He and Meade knew each other long. What was ironic, he was born and lived right across from West Point in New York, and his dad had a foundry and made cannon for the Union Army. Meade, very well educated, very intelligent. Uh, Commanding troops maybe was another issue, but as uh, a, an Indian, as I say, sort of a wild Indian roaming around, we had some of those people in Vietnam, but we called them special forces. They were guys that on their own they could do a heck of a job, but you put them with a bunch of other people and they couldn't find their way around the circus tent. But Warren, after Meade asked him to go up the Little Round Top and find out what was going on up there after hearing all the noise, Warren got himself up with the signal people on the north side of Little Round Top, the side toward Wheatfield Road. And that's where the big rocks are. That's where a statue is. And no, Warren is not 6'8". He was about 5'3". Everybody thinks his statue is representing his height. Not quite. And what was ironic, the position he was in, a lot of people describe it as maybe not the best to be observing everything that was going on up there, because when Vincent put his people in the South Slope, they were described as being in a hole. Warren didn't even know they were there. Some talk about acoustic shadows, but I think Warren could have been a little bit more mobile, but he wasn't. Once he got to the signal station, he pretty much stayed there. And there was some sniping. Eventually, he got shot later on, but I think Hazlitt's artillery drew that. But his time on Little Round Top was well spent. I think overall he probably had his best day in the Army of Potomac on July 2nd. But he was talking to Daniel Klingel, farmer, about the road net and everything. He was talking to people that were coming up with the Sixth Corps, giving them some ideas what was going on with the battle. He was talking to some newspaper correspondents. He had a discussion with Martin and Hazlitt about placing artillery up there. He was a busy guy for about an hour and a half till a little bit after 6. Uh, when he left the hill for good and went to Meade and told him what was going on. Somewhere around 5:30. I have the timeline in the book. I'm not going to look it up. It's easy to check. I can't commit all this to memory. But he knew he needed some more troops up there, and he saw Weed moving westward along Wheatfield Road. So he jumped on his horse. It's the first time he got off the hill in about an hour and a half. Jumped on his horse, rode down the north spine of Little Round Top, and caught the last regiment in Weed's brigade, who was Patty O'Rourke in the 140th New York. And he knew O'Rourke. And he said to O'Rourke about, I need a regiment up here. Can I have you guys? And of course, Patty said, no, but I got to follow. And then Warren said, all right, I'll take responsibility for it. Just like Vincent did down in the wheat field that got the Little Round Top battle started. And that's the cover of my book. That's Vincent intercepting Captain Jay, who was Sykes's aide, asking him, yes, what his orders were, and said, on my own recall, I'll take the brigade up there, yada, yada, yada. I love these kind of stories. And you can believe them because just with all the chaos and all the command issues that were going, and plus me trying to save that flank after Sickles' move. And it's interesting, Jim Hessler went to my talk the other day, and I've changed my opinion about Sickles after reading Jim's book. I'm not so hard on him because looking at the way combat occurred, they sort of took the steam out of Longstreet's attack. But that's another story. But anyway, with Warren's activities, he literally did save Little Round Top from sort of an administrative or command standpoint. Functionally, combat standpoint, that was Vincent. I mean, he took care of business up there. He had the 1,300 men plus a few U.S. sharpshooters helping him defend that slope and did an unbelievable job. I'm working on Geary, George Green, and I'm not going to say his middle name. Everybody says his middle name. He was the only George Green at Gettysburg. Come on. You don't have to put the Sears in there. And the Second Division of the 12th Corps. Very similar situations. Green's brigade had roughly the same number of people that Vincent did. And of course, he ended up being the extreme right flank of the Union Army, and Vincent was the extreme left flank of the Union Army. But I say it with a lot of respect. And I pulled a painting of Vincent out of the West Point Library. Unfortunately, Savas couldn't print it in the book because there was some issues with the resolution or whatever. But he looks like who was the British commander at Waterloo? The infantry commander. Uh, ah, I'm thinking of the German commanders and Napoleon and whatever. The British commander. Ah, anyway,
Wellington? Are you talking about
Wellington.
Wellington?
Wellington. They have a painting that looked like Wellington's body with Warren's head put on top of it,
Yeah.
with an unbelievable uniform and all kind of sashes and all kind of stuff. And I'm looking at that, and it's like nobody's ever had that printed or published before. I was disappointed that Sabbath couldn't get it in the book, but I still have it. I use it when I do my live programs. But Warren, he was in his game that day, and his wound. A lot of people talk about his wound. He just got grazed with as he said, uh, a ball. He didn't say mini ball. He just said ball, but not bad. He just wrapped it with a handkerchief, and then about 15 minutes later, he was down off the hill, headed toward Meade's headquarters to tell him that they got everything settled on Little Round Top, and the all the other stuff still going on in the wheat field and Rose Farm, and just what a mess down there. And then having Williams from the 12th Corps coming down there to help everybody, and Lockwood and yada yada. Interesting stuff. Just keeps going, Chris. More books, right?
More books, more books. Well, and you said a second ago, like, Little Round Top is Warren's best day. Having spent a lot of time with Warren in 1864 during the Overland campaign, I agree with you that the Little Round Top is his best day because it certainly doesn't get any better for him in 1864 than it did for him atop Little Round Top for sure. As he sends Vincent in, and he sends in O'Rourke. A lot of these guys don't live long enough to make a huge impression, and yet their presence at the moment of crisis, at the point of crisis, is instrumental. How would you rate O'Rourke? How would you rate Strong Vincent?
I give these two men full credit for not just what they did, but for how they had their units set up. That the fact that after they were, in Vincent's case, mortally wounded, and in O'Rourke's case, he was killed outright, shot in the neck. But their command system stayed solid. And you have to credit the commander with setting up his unit in such a way that it wouldn't be chaotic if they wouldn't be there. Now, Vincent hung around for a little while after he got wounded. They pulled him up to the top of the hill. There's a stone carved up by the castle, which is the New York monument to the 44th and the 12th New York. And that's another story. With the 83rd in front of the 44th New York on the south slope of Little Round Top, same thing happened with the 83rd in front of the 12th New York at Gaines Mill in the Seven Days campaign. So that was a precedent for it. And nobody's ever talked about that. But anyway, that's why it was fun doing the research, Chris. But Vincent had his unit set up, and he was actually trying to get the the refused flank of the 16th Michigan back in order. And of course, his sword was still strapped to his horse. He was using his wife's riding crop, but he was further down the slope than Triani's painting. And some people have the cenotaph that's over on the south slope, a little round top near their monument, is not where he was wounded. He was over behind the 16th Michigan when he was wounded. Same thing with Patty O'Rourke. Patty led his troops up there, and what was amazing, Washington Roebling, this guy's career. I mean, I have the biography that was done on him. People don't know Washington Roebling married Warren's sister, who helped finish the Brooklyn Bridge. She was just as smart as all the engineers. But people have that thing all screwed up. They got married January 1865. They have other years and other months and whatever. But O'Rourke did not have time to get his troops to load their weapons or to fix their bayonets. And of course, troops marching, you don't want bayonets on the weapons because accidents happen, people can get stabbed. And you don't want weapons loaded before you need to use them because they can misfire, accidental discharges, just all kind of stupid things. And they happen. I mean, even in Vietnam, what we called locked and loaded, we did not have a magazine with a round in the chamber until we thought we were going to be engaged because crap happens. And of course, you're out there in the woods at night. You don't want to discharge around. That tells the bad guys where you are. Not a good thing.
Yeah.
We what we called noise and light discipline. You make no noise and there's no lights. But O'Rourke, when they got to the top of Little Round Top, and I showed people roughly where they came in. And I think they came in two places, and both of them, ironically, are the accesses up to the flat part of the topographical crest. The one is down closer to the 44th New York Monument, and the other one is where now they have the new assembly area. I think they had both the companies, one company went one way and one went the other, but they met on the other side. And I have a painting by, or what's called a diagraph by a fellow by the name of Morris, who shows the exact time when the 140th contacted the 48th Alabama and part of the 4th Texas on that slope. And they just bodily crashed into them. Now, a short time later, they got the bayonets on and they got some rounds in their chambers. But first contact with those two units, they just crashed into them like a rugby scrum. And there
Yeah.
was only 100 or so of them. There wasn't 200 or 300. There was only 100 of them, but the force of that attack, and I give Patty O'Rourke credit for that because he was right in front of them. And his guys loved him. And if you don't love some guy, if he's up there out front, you're maybe watching a little bit because you know if he gets exposed, maybe you could save your cookies a little bit. But in this case, they were right behind him and were hard charging, even when he was taken down. And I estimated after all the readings, he didn't get hit the top of the slope. He got hit part way down, very close to where Vincent got wounded. And there's enough narratives around the stories that show that they probably were wounded within maybe 20, 30 yards of each other.
Wow.
But a fascinating story. Patty O'Rourke finished first in his class at West Point. He was Irish, born in Ireland, uh, uh, just a hard worker and a good per. Everybody loved him. Just one of those kind of people. But he was probably one of the better commanders in Weed's brigade. Although, you look at what some of these guys do under pressure, you never can tell until they get put to the test what they're going to do. But O'Rourke had a good reputation before he was there, and obviously Vincent had a good reputation before they got there. So these were the doobies, the dependable people that in stressful situations you knew they were going to do their job. But it's unfortunate that O'Rourke was taken out so early in that combat, but his troops didn't miss a beat. They followed right through and they did what they needed to do and cleared that slope very quickly. The Texans and the Alabamans, after we had the rugby scrum, they left the area pretty quickly.
Yeah, yeah. I'm a big fan of the 140th New York. I spend time with them, of course, in the wilderness when they're part of those opening charges. But being a good Western New Yorker myself, they're from the Rochester area, so I always like to give them a little call out.
Your Rochester racehorses.
That's right. That's right. So you've talked about Chamberlain on and off throughout our program. Do you have a final assessment of our Lord and Savior, Josh Willard Chamberlain?
I do not beat up Chamberlain in my book. I give him full credit for what he did. But I also wanted to give other people full credit too. Chamberlain did a great job, and considering him being, a professor of rhetoric and knowing lots of languages, and a lot of people don't realize he was a birder too, a bird.
Yeah.
Yep. I have an anecdote in the book about whippoorwill calls that the Confederates supposedly were using. Well, not realizing Chamberlain knew all about whippoorwill calls. But whippoorwills are nocturnal, so Chamberlain would have known if they were using whippoorwill calls during daytime. Not. And then I had another question about, do Alabama whippoorwills sound different than Gettysburg whippoorwills or different than what Chamberlain would be used to with Maine whippoorwills? I don't know. Do they have accents? Hey, who
Well,
knows?
see, out there, they're whippo-wills,
Yeah, yeah, there you go.
they're
But
whippo-wills.
but but Chamberlain, and he was not feeling too well at Gettysburg. He had dengue fever, malaria, something that he got during 7 Days battle. He wasn't 100%. Then he got wounded twice. He got shot in the foot, and that hurts. And then he got shot in the sword scabbard on the left side and bruised his thigh pretty nasty. And then he was dealing with the guys from the Second Maine that he inherited, 120 guys from the Second Maine that some confusion about their term of service. But I'll tell you, he did a heck of a job of pulling those guys together, and they were about ready to mutiny from everybody else. And Chamberlain said he would help them, and he did. He made every effort to try to help them, but I don't think he was able to overwhelm the mistake that the recruiter made. But they fought hard for him. And the Gallon painting, the Dale Gallon painting with Tozier holding the regimental flag and a weapon in the other hand, Tozier was from that unit, from the Second Maine. But I give and looking at his background, I mean, he was a college guy. I mean, I don't look at you as a college guy, even though you are. You're a professor and you do writing and you do all kind of out. And St. Bonaventure is one of my favorite schools, by the way. Chris, when I was going to Penn State, St. Bonaventure had one of the best basketball teams in the country.
Sure,
This
sure.
this was before we got into the NCAA thing. It was NIT, and the Bonnies were always in the NIT because they always did so well. But I watched them play Gannon and
Oh
other
yeah,
schools
sure.
for West. Oh yeah, oh come on, get out of here. My brother went to Gannon actually,
A
and
strong Vincent territory up there.
got an accounting degree.
Yeah.
Yep. But looking at Chamberlain from his background and the kind of things he got involved with, I give that man for being so courageous and caring about his men and the job that he did without military training. Now, General Ames helped them a whole bunch, and they still talk about, Ames, even after Ames got promoted to the division command, he still worked with Chamberlain. Strong Vincent had the same kind of help. These non-West Point guys, they found ways to get smart about what they needed to do with military tactics. I mean, looking at Casey's book, I've tried to read that. I go half blind when I read that thing. Just some of the stuff in there drives you nuts. But they had practical education, and Chamberlain took to it so well. And I give him full credit for everything he did. It was after the war. Some of his stories kept getting, a little more interesting. I akin to dime novels, but thank God for Melcher and Spear, who I have both of their biographies, and they have certain opinions about him being a little bit vain about things and whatever. But I give Chamberlain credit that man did a heck of a job for being an untrained military person, and give him full credit for his defense. I don't think he saved it necessarily because you had three other brigades there that did equal work. And the 83rd PA worked with Chamberlain's 20th Maine a lot on that flank later on in the battle towards 7 o'clock when they were about ending the combat. He was working with the 83rd PA. The 83rd PA slid over a little bit to cover some of his right flank so he could do that. People talk about a hairpin formation. It was more like a paper clip. It wasn't that sharp. I mean, if you go up on that position, the Chamberlain lane or road that is on the east side of the spur is raised up somewhere around 4 to 5 feet over what elevations Warren was showing in his after the war map. So that slope was a little more severe. You look at it today, and in some parts of it, it's almost level with that on down toward the north or northwest or northeast slope, a little round top. But that's why you have to sit there and read the ground because it isn't exactly the way it was during the battle. But I like Chamberlain. I just think the Killer Angels in the movie Gettysburg sort of went a little overboard, and you got to make it dramatic so the average person can get interested in it. But I think that was another thing why my reassessment tag got affixed by the Savas people because I was looking at his story too, still giving him full credit, but trying to get the right story on how it actually happened.
Very good. So, Joe, as we head into our final stretch here and wrap things up, um, if folks are thinking like, "Gosh, do I need another book on Little Round Top?" And I would say yes, particularly this one. What is your hope that they take away from taking the time to reassess Gettysburg with you, or reassess Little Round Top with you?
I had one of my reviewers, Chris, uh, and that's a great question. I've been collecting reviews. So far, they've all been good. I am so humbled and so blessed by all of this because I'm a non-professional in this business. I'm a registered professional engineer by education and trade. I worked in safety and health compliance my whole career. Of course, always been interested in history. But one of my reviewers said there can't be another Gettysburg book on Little Round Top.
Hmm.
You and I know there's a bunch,
There are
and
a
I
bunch.
bought most of them. And if you check the bibliography of my book, a lot of yours are in there
Oh,
too.
thanks. Thank you.
But he went on to say, not only is there a new one, but it is a phenomenal study. I'm humbled. The details of the narrative never bogs down the story. It will be a new standard for perspective battlefield guides to read so they know everything about Little Round Top. Well, everything I think we can know can't be perfect. As I said earlier, things happened 160 some years ago. We don't know exactly what happened, but when people start writing things 20 and 30 years after the war, you got to put more credence in the stuff that was written right after the war because those people were influenced by other stories. They talk to each other. Battles and leaders come out. The official records come out. So, evaluating information was something I was taught in the military, not just the source, but the credibility of the information. And I think, another Gettysburg book, yeah, but Ted Savas had enough confidence in my story and the fact that I did take a different approach and that my perspective was pretty much from a soldier's viewpoint and how a soldier would read the battle, how a soldier would read the ground, the kind of reactions that the soldiers had. I think that's what makes it interesting. And I did not discount anything any other writers wrote. I have a lot of their information in there, but I used it to corroborate some of the things that I was coming up with after reading all the material that was out there. I mean, I could show you my library here. I have pretty much every book I have in the bibliography, and the ones I don't have here, I got out of the Army Archive. I mean, I have what you and I both know is called a working library. I can show you the piles of books on the floor. That's the real test, right? But I think people will find, and I've had friends read through it in 2 days, and I told them, "What's the rush?" But they said it was an easy read. I think they will see that difference in a perspective. And it not only makes the story more interesting, but I think it makes it closer to actually what happened. I think we can't be perfect, but I think we can be closer than what some writers and some authors have done in the past. And I spent 8 years with this, 5 years doing the research. I mean, I dug, and then 3 years working through process with Ted with the manuscript to get it to a point where, we had a very readable story. My maps with Hal Jesperson, that was intentional because I'm a map person. Hal told me that I could have gone with my rough drafts that I gave him. But I said, no, I want you to do them because of the clarity of your maps and of the reputation that you have. And I said, and I want your name on the map. If you don't have his name on the map, you have to pay for that.
Yeah.
So if you let him put his name on the map, you don't have to pay extra for that. But anyway, Chris, yep, that's what I was looking at, and with the reviews that I've gotten so far, I think I was able to accomplish that. And believe me, Mr. Savas is very happy with what's been going on with the book.
Well, when Ted's happy, we're all happy. So that's a big plus. So I really appreciate just your willingness to ask questions, to question conventional wisdom, and just be willing to kind of double check, trust but verify sort of thing. And so I just like that you got into those weeds. You asked a lot of questions about those weeds, and I think you came to some pretty interesting and unique conclusions. And I really like that soldier perspective a lot. So
Thank you. I
yeah.
appreciate that, Chris. Hey, from you, I not only have a lot of respect for you, I love being with you on your battlefield walks and your programs. I mean, you always uh, take not just an interesting approach to it, but a very familiar approach to it. And I think that's why you do so well with your stories too. But thank you for asking me to do this with you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Joe. Thanks for being with us today. I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.